The early promise of digital government was built on a vision of a frictionless state. Automated systems would instantly connect citizens with the exact services they needed, stripping away the friction of traditional bureaucracy. Over the last 20 years, governments globally adopted a digital by default posture. The logic was strictly economic. Moving citizens online would maximize operational efficiency and drastically reduce administrative costs. But as public services digitized, they did not eliminate the bureaucracy. They merely hid it behind user interfaces. This bar chart illustrates the sheer scale of the resulting exclusion. In the UK alone, 5.8 million households rely entirely on mobile data to access the internet, and over 11 million adults lack the essential digital skills required to handle information securely. Navigating high-security, complex government applications through a constrained smartphone data plan is inherently slower and significantly more expensive for citizens. When technological innovation optimizes for efficiency without intentionally engineering for inclusion, digital interfaces stop being civic enablers. They become insurmountable gatekeepers. A rigidly digital state is a broken model if the pursuit of systemic efficiency actively blocks the most vulnerable citizens from accessing their basic rights. The theoretical risks of this digital-first approach materialized with clarity during the rollout of the UK's Universal Credit welfare system. Universal Credit was engineered to replace nuanced, discretionary face-to-face support from human caseworkers with rigid algorithmic terminals and mandatory interactive digital journals. Public administration scholars identify this as screen-level bureaucracy. The machine interface fully dictates the conditionality of a citizen's survival, removing human context entirely. The real-world consequences for digitally excluded claimants were immediate and severe. Failing to navigate the digital logging requirements resulted in delayed payments, harsh benefit sanctions, rent arrears, and a surge in evictions. Official policy stated that offline, telephone-based support routes existed. In practice, researchers found those analog routes were actively discouraged to preserve the system's operational efficiency. The burden of navigating this hostile digital infrastructure was fully outsourced onto the claimants themselves, forcing them to rely on family members and informal community carers just to access baseline state support. Digitizing the welfare system successfully lifted the administrative weight off the government's balance sheet, but it weaponized the platform against the exact demographic it was designed to protect. Bureaucratic friction is a deliberate design choice. Administrative burden theory proves that complex state systems yield severe distributive consequences for marginalized groups who have fewer resources to navigate them. This user journey map illustrates the first mechanism of exclusion: learning costs. This is the cognitive time and effort required merely to discover a service exists, decipher dense legal jargon, and figure out how to apply across unlinked department portals. Next are compliance costs. These are the tangible expenditures of time and money required to follow the rules, like gathering historical identity documents or trying to navigate multi-factor authentication without a reliable smartphone. Finally, the system extracts psychological costs. This encompasses the acute stress, the loss of personal autonomy, and the societal stigma users absorb when interacting with punitive compliance systems. Mitigating this requires implementing the once-only beta sharing principle. By allowing departments to share verified information, governments prevent citizens from repeatedly resubmitting historical data, reducing compliance friction. When automated eligibility systems are deployed without human oversight, they inevitably generate administrative errors. The burden of correcting those algorithmic mistakes is pushed onto the citizen, who must fight an unresponsive digital interface to restore their benefits. International analyses confirm that these administrative burdens consistently thwart broader human development objectives, regardless of the specific geopolitical context. Unless learning, compliance, and psychological costs are identified and dismantled during the earliest phases of policy formulation, the resulting digital interface will act as a tool of structural exclusion. This distribution curve represents standard user-centered design. These methodologies implicitly optimize digital systems for the unmarked user, the individual in the center of the curve who holds privilege across various intersecting identities. Patricia Hill Collins' framework of intersectionality demonstrates that human experiences do not exist in single categories. A non-native speaker from a low-income background with low digital literacy faces a compounded exponential exclusion that optimizing for the center of the curve will never resolve. We see this failure sharply in centralized identity verification systems. Relying on rigid markers like deep credit histories or passports instantly blocks marginalized groups, immigrants, and those fleeing domestic violence. Extensive user research shows that 46% of young people aged 13 to 17 do not even possess a dedicated phone number. Designing a login system around mobile verification renders the service entirely useless for nearly half of that demographic. Sasha Costanza-Chalk's paradigm of design justice offers a structural corrective. It demands that governments transition from unilaterally designing for citizens to actively sharing decision-making power and designing with marginalized communities. This requires abandoning the outdated medical model of disability, which views impairment as an individual deficit requiring a cure. Instead, inclusive service design relies on the social model of disability. A user is not disabled by their visual impairment. They are actively disabled by the physical and organizational barriers the state constructs, like a government website lacking screen reader compatibility. Because lived experience is strictly non-transferable, practices like able-bodied designers wearing blindfolds for disability simulations are widely discredited. They reduce systemic marginalization to a temporary sensory deficit. Building state infrastructure optimized solely for the privileged majority actively and mathematically reproduces systemic inequality by design. Public sector services frequently interact with citizens during periods of acute vulnerability or crisis. Integrating trauma-informed design directly into the user interface is essential for establishing psychological safety. This split screen compares two UI approaches. Applying SAMHSA principles means rejecting the punitive red alert error messages on the left and replacing them with clear, transparent explanations of exactly why sensitive data is required on the right. Behind that interface, architecting secure data sharing frameworks allows a citizen to consent to having their vulnerable status flagged across the government. This eliminates the re-traumatizing requirement to repeatedly disclose domestic abuse or severe medical conditions on multiple forms. But designing for inclusion extends beneath the surface interface. As public services integrate artificial intelligence, the underlying data architecture dictates whether a system is equitable. Data models are highly vulnerable to proxy bias. A proxy is a seemingly neutral data point, like a postal code, that strongly correlates with a protected characteristic like race or socioeconomic status. If an algorithm optimizing social care allocation or fraud detection trains on these proxies, it systematically disadvantages marginalized communities, executing biased decisions through an unauditable black box. To combat this opacity, the UK government launched the Algorithmic Transparency Recording Standard, or ATRS. It forces public sector bodies to explicitly document their use of automated decision-making. This structural blueprint outlines the mandatory reporting. Tier 1 provides a clear, non-technical rationale for the public. Tier 2 demands exhaustive technical specifications, detailing the exact datasets used and the specific risk mitigations implemented to prevent discriminatory outcomes. To ensure these AI models learn accurately, government data must be meticulously engineered. AI cannot rely on highly aggregated executive dashboards. It requires secure access to granular, unaggregated raw data to understand the true variance within diverse populations. Operationalizing inclusion means protecting citizens simultaneously at two extremes, securing their psychological safety at the surface interface and aggressively auditing against proxy bias deep within the algorithmic architecture. Treating inclusion as a retrospective, bureaucratic tick box exercise violates legal frameworks like the public sector equality duty and produces inherently flawed software. From a purely operational perspective, exclusionary design creates massive failure demand. This is the hidden, compounding cost imposed on a government system when citizens cannot successfully use a primary digital service the first time. When an interface is cognitively overwhelming, users generate errors that staff must painstakingly correct by hand, or they are forced to revert to highly expensive manual channels like call centers and in-person appointments. Initiating dynamic equality impact assessments during the earliest problem definition phase preemptively neutralizes these cataclysmic service failures before a single line of code is written. This financial flowchart models the macroeconomic return of inclusion. Current estimates indicate that for every single pound invested in digital inclusion initiatives, it generates 15 pounds of societal return through increased human capital and heightened national productivity. Furthermore, preemptively utilizing robust accessibility standards like the U.S. Web Design System protects the state from the unbudgeted costs of retroactive engineering, legal challenges, and severe reputational damage. Inclusive public service design serves as the essential architectural requirement for a functioning, equitable, and economically viable state.